Recently, we had a little issue which we have resolved with one of our mining companies whose lease had expired after 30 years, and it was our desire to take it over and use Ghanaian expertise to be able to also exploit that resource and let the benefits remain in our country. Happily, we reached an amicable resolution to work together to transition that mine into Ghanaian ownership. But it leads me to what my thoughts are, that we must have an indigenization program for taking control of some of our natural resources. And so in the next few months, we'll develop a policy on indigenous participation.
In just 4 months, Ghana earned $3 billion without discovering any new gold reserves. So how did that happen? Here's a hint. It had something to do with Captain Ibrahim Traoré. But what's the real story behind this unexpected fortune? Let's break it down. Ghana has long been one of Africa's top gold producers, sitting in the continent's Golden Triangle, along with South Africa and Sudan. Despite having plenty of gold, the country wasn't truly benefiting from its wealth. Year after year, gold worth billions left the country, but very little of that money stayed behind to help the local economy. The issue wasn't about how much gold there was, it was about who controlled it. Most of Ghana's gold mines were run by foreign companies from places like South Africa, Australia, the UK, and Canada. These companies had private deals to extract the gold, refine it overseas, and sell it globally. Ghana's role in this process? Basically, just dig the gold up and hand it over. The real profits were made far away, in boardrooms and bank accounts that had little to do with Ghana. Along with the gold, these companies took valuable data, price control, and financial transparency. Many found ways to hide profits, use loopholes, or structure their businesses to avoid taxes. By the time Ghana's government tried to step in, most of the money had already vanished into offshore accounts. For years, people asked the same question. How could a country so rich in resources still struggle with debt, unemployment, and a weak currency? But instead of answers, there was mostly silence. That changed in early 2025, not because of protests or political speeches, but because of data. Cold, hard numbers. Between January and April, Ghana earned $2.7 billion from gold, more than triple the amount during the same time 2 years earlier. Gold exports also shot up from around 7,500 kilograms in early 2023 to over 30,000 kilograms in just 4 months. And this wasn't guesswork. These were actual records from Ghana's Customs Office and Central Bank. Naturally, people wanted to know, did Ghana find more gold? Did mining activity suddenly explode? The answer was both simpler and more powerful. The gold had always been there. Ghana just stopped letting it slip away. The big change wasn't in the mines, it was at the border. The people in charge of watching the gold leave had changed. For the first time, Ghana was no longer letting foreign companies decide how much gold stayed or where it went. A new kind of control was in place, and that idea didn't start in Ghana. It came from a nearby country, from Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Ghana hadn't just gotten lucky, it had been inspired. After watching someone else take bold action, the Ghanaian government decided it was time to stop playing a background role in its own mining sector. That shift was influenced by a new kind of leadership emerging in Africa. Surprisingly, the spark didn't come from big institutions like the IMF or the African Union. It came from a young military leader in a green beret, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't a politician or economist, but a soldier who took charge in a time of crisis and dared to challenge the global economic system. Ghana didn't invent this new approach, but when they saw it working, They acted. They adapted it. And once they did, gold stopped being just a commodity, it became a tool of national power. But how did Ghana's government even learn about what Traoré was doing in Burkina Faso? And why would a civilian president like Mahama follow a model that started with a military-led revolution? To really understand how Ghana went from being a bystander to taking charge of its own resources, you have to understand what Traoré represented not just as a person, but as a symbol of change. Because the transformation in Ghana didn't begin in its own capital, Accra. It started with an idea from beyond its borders. It began in Burkina Faso, led by a 37-year-old military officer who had no financial background, no backing from Wall Street, and no international renown. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré has the courage and clarity to say what others could only mutter. The riches of Africa is stolen by contracts, not by bullets. That clarity resonated well beyond his personal limitations. When Traoré entered government in 2022, many dismissed him as just another military leader in a tired region used to coups. However, he then did something strange. He did not privatize the state. He didn't beg the IMF for funding. "Stop," he yelled instead, looking at the gold that was escaping his country. He banned raw exports, built a national refinery, and demanded that no Grammys be sold until the Burkina Faso people made money first. It was a direct attack on post-colonial economic logic and rocked capitals from Paris to Washington. But in Accra, it elicited a different reaction. It sparked interest. At first, there was silence. There are cautious discussions in business circles, data from think tanks, and a few whispers in Ghana's parliament. Could such a bold concept be implemented in a more evolved democracy like Ghana? Would a country connected to international commerce networks dare to cut off the middlemen? The real test came when John Dramani Mahama returned to office in early 2025. The previous Mahama administration had faced economic difficulties and had come under fire for maintaining the status quo. But this time, something was different. Instead of making pretentious speeches, he returned with structural goals. Within a few weeks, the signs were clear. Mahama was not going to use the same old tactic again. Instead, he was preparing to do it all over again. The only blueprint on his desk, what about it? It was not provided by the World Bank. Burkina Faso is where it started. Why would a democratic civilian president model his economic recovery after a military-led revolution? The solution lies in the findings. Speaking was not all Traoré had done. He achieved measurable success. His gold reforms doubled national reserves, maintained the value of the local currency, and even reduced Burkina Faso's dependency on international aid. Western observers described it as radical, but African leaders saw it differently. Proof. Mahama wasn't going to borrow a uniform. He had borrowed a useful formula and was applying it. Furthermore, compared to Traoré, Mahama had superior infrastructure, a more advanced banking system, and greater international prestige. That meant he could do what Traoré had done, but faster, more extensively, and with less internal resistance. He therefore began laying the groundwork. Post a remark in the space provided below to lend your voice to the complete emancipation of Africa. For more educational videos like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's move forward. The first sign of the shift came silently. The creation of a new governmental body to regulate gold, the Ghana Gold Board. This was no ordinary bureaucracy. It was based on Burkina Faso's National Administration of Resource Wealth. Much to Traoré's chagrin, it aimed to remove foreign influence on gold decisions. However, it was inspired by more than just structure. Mahama began to reiterate Traoré's underlying idea. Gold is not merely a commodity. In politics, it's power. Furthermore, unless African states gained direct control over it, they would never be able to fully govern it. In contrast to previous administrations that were willing to negotiate better terms with foreign miners, Mahama took a more severe stance. If you want Ghana's gold, you have to abide by its laws. For a while. This was more than just an economic strategy. It was related to the realignment of philosophies. Ghana was communicating to the world that it no longer viewed money as something to be drawn to by means of tax breaks and investment conferences. It was ready to defend itself because it felt that money was already buried beneath its feet. Naturally, implementing the Traoré model required more than just copying and pasting policies. Ghana had to adapt it to the circumstances. Unlike Burkina Faso, Ghana was a democracy with established investor relations and a regional financial hub. It lacked the funds for a surprise attack. It needed a quiet revolution that would draw notice without inciting reprisals. That is exactly what Mahama created. In just a few weeks, restrictions that had previously been unthinkable became law. Foreign gold traders were excluded unless they complied with strict national regulations. Multinational firms were forced to provide a portion of their production for state reserves, and the Ghana Gold Board inspected every ounce of gold exported. None of this would have happened if a living example hadn't trusted them. Then Traoré handed that to Mahama. No romantic relationship, but permission to be bold. The following was not just policy. It made money, and that profit came with power, both financial might and diplomatic influence. But the real game-changer had not yet arrived. Because after Ghana took possession of the gold, the question of what they would do with it came up. Ghana adopted the Traoré model and then made a non-philosophical turn. It served a purpose: take back control and guard the vault. There was no turning back. Inspiration has led to the evolution of legislation. However, this was the most challenging part: enforcement. Ghana then displayed daring in a way that stunned observers both at home and abroad. The new governmental agency tasked with overseeing the sector was created: the Ghana Gold Board. The Mahama administration wasted no time. It implemented a number of policies that fundamentally shifted the country's mining laws and the balance of power. One of the first surprises was the mandatory 20% door-bar transfer. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a directive. All Ghanaian mining enterprises, both foreign and indigenous, were required to physically transfer 20% of their stock to the Gold Board before they could export a single ounce of refined gold. You have bars, but why? Because raw gold is simple to work with. It might be tainted, underreported, or sold off through questionable methods. It is possible to locate semi-pure gold bars, nevertheless. It is a financial fingerprint. By demanding this form, Ghana made sure it was seeing what was real and not what was announced. This approach instantly put pressure on foreign companies used to exporting gold under private contracts with no government oversight. Now, they had to prove everything. They also didn't like it. Some businesses promised to pull out. Others quietly pushed for the rules to be relaxed. But Ghana stayed unwavering. Encouraged by rising global gold prices and a public tired of lawful robberies, Mahama's government called their bluff. And the outcomes came in a flash. Ghana's central bank's reserves began to rise. Within 3 months of the new policy, gold holdings jumped from less than 9 metric tons to over 30 tons, shocking international financial experts. These were not digital numerals displayed on a screen. Stored in governmental vaults, this physical gold represented true independence and value. With the gold came monetary sovereignty. In order to stabilize its currency and pay for imports, Ghana, like many other African nations, has traditionally depended on foreign exchange reserves, mostly in the form of US dollars. Dollars, however, are vulnerable to IMF regulations, currency fluctuations, and political pressure. Gold. For gold, there is no master. With an abundance of a resource that was highly prized, Ghana began to respond in subtle but efficient ways. International financiers were forced to negotiate instead of imposing rigid terms. Investors had to deal with a developing local sector, in addition to their previous demands for tax holidays. Even the Central Bank of Ghana could afford to take a more assertive approach to managing the cedi, the nation's currency. But this expanded power extended beyond economics. It was planned. Ghana used its expanding reserves to alter its trade approach. Instead, than relying solely on deals denominated in dollars, it began investigating barter arrangements and bilateral trade using gold as collateral. Rumor had it that talks were on to transfer refined gold to nations in Asia and the Middle East in exchange for energy, machinery, and infrastructure expenditures that would not impact Western financial institutions. And at the core of this revolution was one unbreakable rule. Ghana's gold remains in Ghana unless it generates revenue. Mahama's government also took the important step of outlawing foreign gold dealers almost entirely in order to enforce this rule. Unlike the previous era, when dozens of foreign corporations, especially from the UAE and Switzerland, prowled Ghana's marketplaces, grabbing up gold at below-market costs, the new policy tightened the ring. The export environment was now limited to companies that the state had approved and screened. They were also bound by strict laws governing taxes, openness, and reinvestment in the community's economy. At first, critics warned that this would turn off shoppers, but the opposite happened. The government's assurances and the unambiguous legislation led to the emergence of a new generation of local entrepreneurs and investment groups. Small and medium-sized Ghanaian companies began building trading houses, logistics networks, and refining facilities after being suppressed by foreign dominance. They were no longer required to ask for permission. The gates were open to them, but closed to those who once made the laws. At the same time, Ghana increased its funding for technical training programs, allowing young Ghanaians to work in the mining, metallurgy, and mineral finance industries. In just a few months, the value chain around the mines rather than the mines themselves was creating new jobs. For the first time, gold was generating industries rather than just making news. But none of this happened in a vacuum. It was a logical extension of the policy change that was previously described. Ghana has been a fan of Traoré. Then it mimicked him. But at this point, they even surpassed his objectives. Not only did they stop the bleeding, they started creating new organs. In Ghana, gold was no longer viewed as a passive investment. It was now a lever, a sword, and a shield. The country was becoming a value creator rather than a victim of exports. Gold created the foundation, but the real transformation had not yet occurred. Because the impact of Ghana's economic policy was not as great. In this manner, other African nations began to observe and take notes. In the past, the chain was composed of gold. It was now in Ghana's custody and had become the key. By the time Ghana increased its reserves, modified its export laws, and kicked out corrupt foreign companies, it was doing more than just making money. They were building a blueprint. The real power of a plan, however, is not in its visual appeal. Its copyability is what makes it so. And that's exactly what started happening all over Africa. Other nations were keeping a close eye on Ghana. A new question began to echo across parliaments, embassies, and presidential security briefings, among other places of power. If Ghana can do it, why can't we? It went beyond envy. It was a revelation. It was discovered that the old dig, export, hope paradigm could not be sustained. Ghana has shown that there was another way. one that required more courage than cash. Ghana, a former gold producer, became a continental model at that precise moment. In state-run mining ministries in Mali, where political turmoil had already soured ties with Western partners, rumors of doing it the Ghanaian way began to spread. Officials had been concerned for years that over 60% of their gold was either being trafficked through shadow networks, siphoned off by powerful foreign organizations, or being unreported. After Ghana showed what centralized monitoring might do in a matter of months, Mali's transitional government began developing plans for their own gold board. Niger, which is also facing economic challenges as a result of the separation with France, made the lesson even more clear. If you want to withstand loneliness, you need to have inner strength. What you need is reserves, not debt. And the greatest way to boost reserves is to manage your most abundant natural resource. Even countries that are not currently under sanctions started to reevaluate their organizational structures. After years of fighting foreign mining companies in its vast gold belt, Tanzania re-examined its local ownership laws. Discussions regarding resuming required value addition measures that had been put on hold for years began to resurface as a result of investor pressure. But perhaps the most symbolic moment was experienced by Zimbabwe, which has been beset by international sanctions and long accused of economic incompetence. For many years, Zimbabwe's gold trade was beset by accusations of smuggling and corruption. In early 2025, however, a prominent economic counselor to the president publicly praised Ghana's gold model, calling it a Pan-African alternative to colonial economics in the 21st century. It was more than just flattery. It was a sign of purpose. Ghana's plan spread like wildfire because it was so simple. There was no need for armed takeovers or ideological revolutions. It required something much more radical to say no to international regulations and yes to national interests. That shift in mindset, from appeasement to assertiveness, caused the dominoes to begin rolling throughout the continent. Ghana also did more than just support it. The country began actively engaging in private meetings, trade forums, and strategic summits with other African leaders. Ghana Gold even set up lines of contact with regional partners to share technical expertise on tracking, refining, and trading gold through state institutions. For the first time in decades, an African model of cooperation, apart from the United States and Europe, was taking shape. It was not based on charity, loans, or aid. Pure wealth that was refined internally and traded on African conditions served as its cornerstone. That made the West anxious. When international mining organizations began to release findings about resource nationalism, investor trust was put at risk. Western research groups warned of the emergence of authoritarian paradigms in resource governance and issued ambiguous threats against Burkina Faso and Ghana. Financial journalists argued whether foreign direct investment could be at risk due to this tendency. But they didn't understand the goal. The intention was not to discourage investment. It was about changing the rules governing that investment. African countries were not refusing to cooperate. Instead of exploitation, they were advocating for alliances founded on respect for one another. And instead of isolating itself, Ghana had shown that this could be accomplished through stringent internal control and policy. Laws and export earnings, however, might not be the biggest consequences of Ghana's gold shift. It falls under the discipline of psychology. Instead of viewing gold as a distant government issue, young people, entrepreneurs, engineers, and students throughout Africa began talking about it as a tool for empowerment. They understood that they didn't need wealth from abroad. It may be developed, protected, and used here in Africa. Traoré ignited the spark. Ghana added fuel to the fire. A daring new notion that freedom is not only political, but also economic, is currently spreading throughout the continent. Furthermore, it is not only quantifiable in words but also in gold. That is the reason this moment is so potent. A chain reaction is triggered when one country gains independence and prospers. The $3 billion given to Ghana wasn't merely a settlement. There was a message. The old game is ended for those who have long benefited from Africa's silence. African countries are asserting the worth of their own soil and taking control of their own futures as a new age dawns. However, what are your thoughts? Can Africa's ascent be stopped now? Or is this only the start?